Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Open to Export webinar about the opportunities and challenges of exporting to the USA. My name is William Barnes-Graham, and I am the Senior Content Editor at the Institute of Export and International Trade. Open to Export is a free online service helping small businesses get ready to sell overseas through our step-by-step articles and guides, regular webinars, our Export Action Plan tool, and our quarterly competitions. You can find out about all of these on our website at www.opentoexport.com. Open to Export is powered by the Institute of Export and International Trade, the UK's professional membership body for traders, endorsed by the World Trade Organization and the International Chamber of Commerce as a small business champion. We offer a unique range of individual and business membership benefits, education and training, catering for beginners through to master's degrees, and an always exciting and prestigious programme of events celebrating UK businesses' exporting achievements. We will be running a live Q&A later in the session. You can ask questions at any point using the question box on the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen. The general principle here is that we'll ask questions that are relevant to the broader audience, so we won't be able to go into company specifics as such, but if you do have specific questions, we can refer you to our technical helpline afterwards. We have three great speakers today. Gary Bayliss from Export Access will give an overview of some of the documentary and regulatory challenges you could face sending goods to the USA. Richard Paxman will give some insights into his experiences as a successful exporter to the market. And kicking things off, we have Neil Payne from Commisceo Global, who's going to give an overview of the business culture there that you need to be aware of. So over to you, Neil.
Thank you very much, Will, and welcome everyone to the webinar. Neil Payne from Commisceo, and I've been invited, I guess, as I work in the cultural awareness training field, to try and give some overview and opinions in terms of what you might need to be aware of if you're new to doing business in the USA. So if we could go on to the first slide, that'd be great. So in terms of what do I know, just so you know that they haven't just dragged me off the street and said do a webinar on the US and I've made it all up. I have got some experience. So essentially I run a translation and localization agency for 12 years. That was sold about 5 years ago. 6 years of that we ran an office out of California. Did a lot of business with American clients, so worked a lot at that level with American execs and organizations. Been a professional cultural awareness trainer since 2004, and as a result of that have done a lot of work with Americans, and especially Americans working with other cultures. I've worked with exporters in various guises, doing various things within translation and localization, business development, and I competed in horseback archery for about 10 years against Americans all across the globe. So spent many an hour talking about American politics and society, and really got a fascinating insight into the American psyche and many of the differences, let's say, we're seeing manifest within the political sphere at the moment. So I'm basically going to try and give you my insights, very personal, subjective insights into some of the cultural differences of working and doing business in the USA. So if we go on to the next slide. Firstly, when thinking about the US, we've got to remember, as you know, as Brits as well, if we thought of anyone describing us, we might be horrified with certain stereotypes. It's the same with the USA. We can't really talk about all Americans in the same way. There's a huge amount of diversity. It's a massive continent, massive country, 50 states, you know, different laws, whether federal or state laws across the country, different time zones, and different kind of cultures as well, depending on the regions, whether you're in the East, West, South, Midwest, and Texas itself has got its very unique Texan culture, let's say. So it's important to remember, just as we here have the Welsh, Irish, Scottish, etc., you know, they there also have their differences in terms of their identity, slang, how they dress, and how they do business. So it's important to be wary of, you know, where in the country you are going to be visiting or dealing with. One of the you know, common observations Brits make of who do business in the US is the East-West divide. You know, the East Coast seems a little bit colder, let's say, in terms of just wanting to get business done, where on the West things are a little bit more relaxed. You know, the sunshine, I suppose, helps in that regard. So there's a difference in approach to business, even within, you know, the country itself. Politically, there's a massive divide within the kind of the conservative heartland and, you know, the liberal fringes and the cities. And then very similar to the UK as well, they have this, you know, very acute difference between urban and rural lifestyles and the social divide that comes with that. So it's important to be aware of these differences within American society, within American culture, so that when you're thinking about your end user, your client, your particular niche market or your target audience, that you understand, you know, the language these people are talking, the values that motivate these people and drive them, and some of the, you know, differences that divide them, so that you don't, you know, stumble upon something you don't really want to be talking about, or making, you know, a certain point that it's going to be divisive. And then you've also got the island of California, and, you know, it's very progressive in terms of its laws. It's got Tech Valley. They've almost got created their own little mini, you know, business climate in that part of the USA. So which can be markedly different to other parts of the country as well. So really, the main point is here is, you know, be aware of where you're going and understand that there are going to be some differences in terms of what you come across. So what I'm talking about really is trying to give people a general sense or a general overview of what maybe most Americans may come across as, to especially us Brits or Europeans. So if we go to the next slide, just wanted to really give people kind of a cultural insight into, you know, why we see what we see in America today and where it's all come from. We have to look at the roots of the people, and this very much goes back to, you know, that early colonial history, the Pilgrim story, going over, you know, having to really look after themselves, fighting against, you know, the native Indians, that whole sort of idea. And this has really bred this sense of individualism within American society and culture, where you know, looking after number one is the goal. Taking care of yourself or, you know, your family really is the extent of your responsibilities. So it's very different if you're from, say, a more collective society, say in East Asia, where you're much more thinking about, you know, the wider family, the group, the team, whatever it may be. As a result of this individualism and also this kind of new sense of history, money has become very important within American culture. You know, this has become a means of status and kind of showing progress and a position within society, which is very different to us Brits. Because us Brits, you know, we don't necessarily class each other according to how much money we've got. Usually it comes down to, you know, whether you drink wine or beer, whether you read the Sun, the Daily Mail, or the Guardian, or, you know, what your accent, what school you went to, these sorts of subtle things. In America, that doesn't really, you know, work there. It's about money, you know, and success. And so this is very much tied in with this whole idea of the American dream. You know, you have to take risks, you have to put yourself out there. You know, if you get knocked down, get back up again. And, you know, create your own success. No one's going to do it for you. You have to do it yourself. And also this idea of progress, you know, this idea of the American society, they want to feel that they're progressing towards this idea of modernity, betterment, etc. And we see this manifest in the place itself. So, you know, this great sense of independence now we're seeing in, you know, with the America First line. You know, the gun laws essentially go back to this idea of, you know, the individual having the right to look after themselves against a potentially, you know, evil state. The negative opinions on Obamacare, you know, was one thing that really struck me during that time when I was spending a lot of time with Americans. Is they looked upon us who treasure our NHS, you know, so dearly, as almost like communists. They just didn't understand it, and I almost, you know, couldn't really understand them. But after spending a long time with them, I could kind of see where they're coming from. But it's a very different sense of independence and looking after yourself. And a result of this, it's a very litigious society, because there's been breakdown of kind of community and wider families. The law has kind of taken that place within social and, you know, business relations, and really the rule of law has become very important. So it's, you know, as a result, it's become quite a litigious culture and a litigious society as well. Again, related to this idea of, you know, independence, you know, people in positions of power are expected to, you know, make calls, make the big decisions, and if they go wrong, they're expected, you know, to die, you know, die by the sword sort of thing. It's that whole idea of individual responsibility, and, you know, you're the one that ultimately has to pay the price, not others around you or your team, etc. And also the dog eat dog mentality that links back to this idea of, you know, looking after number one. You know, these all don't come from nowhere. These are all rooted in the kind of American experience that we've seen over the past couple of 100 years. And this idea, you know, within American, especially consumer or retail culture, you know, they want things big, supersized, you know, Whopper, etc. It's this whole idea of linking back to progress, development, change, etc. So when you look at the product, services, and how they go to market, you know, celebrity endorsement is very important. It's all about linking people of success and money to your to what you're selling. Lots of use of aspirational language in terms of, you know, what, you know, the benefits it can give you. We see a massive range of choice in terms of what people want, because they want things tailored specifically for them as individuals. Change is good, so you don't necessarily get this sense of brand loyalty. People will drop your brand for the next new shiny brand with a different color that might happen to appear on the shelves. This idea of constantly having to refresh and change your products, you see this all the time with the language they use. I don't know if you've noticed, but on lots of products in the US, it's always they like to use a phrase like, you know, now with added fortified ingredients, or now with, you know, extra calcium. It's always now with. And it's been shown that the use of this language actually helps boost their sales, because it shows that it's no longer the product it wants. It's a new product that they can kind of come to now and be satiated with. And this idea of customer as king as well goes back to the need for the individual to feel that they are getting, you know, an individual tailored service, and they are being looked after. So if we go into the next slide, I just wanted to finish off really with 10, I suppose, my 10 top tips on doing business in the USA, which link back to a lot of the points I was just making. But firstly, you know, time is money in this place. The phrase didn't, you know, it originated in this country. Time is literally given a monetary value. So if people feel that you are wasting the time, you're taking the time, it's almost like you're taking away their success or their ability to reach that success. So being late, you know, not responding quickly to emails, you know, they really have high expectations in terms of time and deliverables. So it's very important to, you know, manage those expectations from the get-go. Be very direct in how you communicate. Us Brits, we can be quite waffly, quite indirect. We tend to beat around the bush, use clever things like innuendo and expect them to understand it. Stay away from it. Just be very direct, very clear in how you want to communicate and what you expect, because it avoids a lot of confusion. Relationships are, you know, not prioritized within the business world. It's about business first. You know, America's the place where the phrase is business, not personal, came from. So if you go in expecting to, you know, spend lots of hours, you know, small talk and going to dinners, it's not necessarily going to happen. This is a place where, you know, they want tasks, they're task orientated, they want tasks done, they want to get the job done. British modesty is not going to get you anywhere in the USA. You absolutely have to go in with the winner mentality. You know, upplay your ambition, your achievements, upplay everything you've done. Don't downplay things, as we culturally tend to do. They're very short-term orientated, so you need to be going in really getting people on side with, you know, quick goals, quick wins. You know, if you're talking to them about things in 3 to 5 years' time, it's going to be a turn-off. Things get, as I said, relating back to the litigious culture, things will get confirmed in writing. So be careful with emails. They're used more and more within litigation. And what you'll find is when tricky topics come up, you'll find that people tend to call you more as opposed to write in email, because it allows them some sort of wiggle room if, you know, something came back on them, in terms of them being able to go back and say, well, I meant this, or that was taken out of context, etc. In terms of their language, they can be very aspirational, so they'll latch themselves to a goal and talk about achieving that and how they're going to achieve that. And sometimes it can be a little bit unrealistic, so you need to use a bit of common sense to try and dampen it. These people work very long hours and they have a rubbish annual holidays, unlike ourselves. So they expect it of others as well. So, late phone calls at night, expect response to emails if they're important. Breakfast meetings very early in the morning are now very common as well. Not to say that Americans don't have any humor, but on the whole, try and keep humor out of like the professional context. Things like irony, innuendo, all the clever British stuff. It doesn't necessarily translate well over there depending on where you are. So try and keep it for out of the meetings or the offices and in the restaurant or wherever it may be. And then lastly, this is a place where business comes first. So don't necessarily expect loyalty from your clients or your suppliers or whoever it may be. You are to a certain extent seen as a stepping stone. So always have that in the back of your mind, and don't put all your eggs into one basket when you're doing business out there. If we flick over to the next slide. It's just to let everyone know that on the Institute of Export website, if you go to the training section, online cross-cultural training, we have a course there on American business culture. There's a promo code. It's on the web page itself. You can see IOE 2019. That gets you 50% off. And on that note, I say thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions at the end of the webinar. I'll hand you back to Will.
Thank you, Neil. And yeah, I can definitely recommend everyone to look at the online cross-cultural trading, which Neil does with us. It's such an important part of global trade. And Neil's also going to be speaking at our Bristol Summit next week, which I'll be saying a little bit more about later on. But now to talk about some of the compliance issues involved in sending things over to the USA. Over to you, Gary Bayliss.
Hi, thanks, William, and hi, everyone. My name's Gary Bayliss. I'm a member of the Institute of Export, and my company, Export Access, helps exporters to gain access to export markets. Export Access acts as the representative office for the UK and Ireland for Registrar Corp USA, which is the leading global provider of FDA compliance assistance services. Today, I'm going to be giving an overview of the main regulatory barriers to trade that exporters face when entering the US market. Next slide, please, William. I'll be focusing today on regulations imposed by the FDA, that's the US Food and Drug Administration. Next slide, William, please. The FDA is an agency of the US Department of Health and Human Services, which in turn is one of the federal executive departments of the US government. The FDA is responsible for protecting public health by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biological products, and medical devices, and by ensuring the safety of the nation's food supply, of cosmetics, and of products that emit radiation. Next slide, please, William. As you'll see from this slide, the FDA now regulates around 12% of all products imported into the USA. That's a little over $273 billion worth of goods. The largest single category is human food and cosmetics, but as you can see from the slide, the aggregate total of life science products is greater. Following the events of 9/11, the US government took steps to mitigate the risk of bioterrorism and the adulteration of food products. And since that time, the FDA has implemented and enforced regulatory controls on a proactive basis. Rather than waiting for products to arrive at US ports and airports, the FDA now reaches out around the world to identify where and how they are made in order to register those companies and to ensure that the products in question are safe. Next slide, please, William. This information obtained by Registrar Corp shows the top 10 countries in terms of numbers of FDA registered food facilities in February 2019, immediately after the most recent registration renewal period. Those listening in from the UK may be interested to note that the UK is conspicuous by its absence from this top 10 list, coming below India in the number of registered food facilities. Next slide, please, William. Figures tell a story. FDA regulations are challenging, complex, and ever evolving, so they present a formidable barrier to US market entry for many exporters. As an example of the complexity of FDA regulations, the FDA's own website contains almost 4,000 approved acronyms. Similarly, to demonstrate the need to be aware of changes, updates, and registration renewal requirements, these figures show how 28% of UK companies failed to renew their food facility registration before the December 2018 deadline. Next slide, please, William. Registrar Corp is the leading global provider of FDA compliance assistance services, and over the last 15 years, we've helped more than 30,000 companies in 160 countries achieve ongoing compliance with FDA regulations. And we currently represent more than 10,000 companies around the world as US FDA agent. We regularly achieve a 5-star Trustpilot rating. Next slide, William, please. Registrar Corp demystifies the FDA compliance process by identifying the FDA regulations that apply to products, explaining the compliance process, and providing assistance services. And lastly, by charging set prices for each service provided. In the past, many of the regulatory compliance matters were dealt with by US lawyers who are known for charging several $100s an hour for their efforts. Next slide, please, William. Some additional benefits with regard to Registrar Corp services are that they are comprehensive, easy to access, and they provide rapid solutions. We also provide further additional services for our clients, including an online portal for all services, prior notice submissions, and continual monitoring of changes to regulations. Next slide, please, William. Although FDA requirements are perhaps the most significant regulatory barrier, there are other regulations that exporters should investigate before entering the market. Next slide, please, William. Depending on the product or services being supplied, exporters may need to investigate regulations on advertising, alcohol, consumer products, and pharmaceuticals. Next slide, William, please. Similarly, it may be necessary to look into regulations on products of animal origin, pesticides, and animal vaccines. In some cases, regulations are imposed by more than one authority, such as animal products, where both the FDA and the US Department of Agriculture impose requirements. This is by no means an exhaustive list, especially as US individual states have their own legislative and regulatory agendas for certain products and services. It's as well to note here, actually, that the US Customs and Border Protection Agency, which is the US Customs Authority, brought in a new automated commercial environment, in other words, a new customs clearance system, about 12 or 18 months ago now, which interfaces with a number of the government's regulatory bodies, including the FDA. So as goods enter the USA, information on them is fed through to the various regulatory bodies. Next slide, please, William. In addition to the regulations I've described earlier, there are other matters which exporters to the USA must take into consideration, such as controls on wooden packaging materials, responsibility for product liability, waste recycling, and customs clearance implications where US fulfillment services are used. Unfortunately, there's no time today to provide more specific details, but I hope that I've raised awareness of the need to investigate technical barriers to trade before entering the US market. The USA is undoubtedly very attractive for exporters, but it has significant challenges that must be identified and overcome if there is to be a real chance of successful market entry. Next slide, William. Here are the contact details for any information or assistance you may require with regard to FDA regulation. And the next slide, William. And here are contact details for any information on or assistance with other technical barriers to trade for exports to the USA. I might not be able to provide assistance for all of these myself, but I should be able to signpost you to companies or organizations that can be of assistance. So thank you for listening. I'll hand you back to William, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar today.
Thank you, Gareth. Sorry, Gary. A really excellent kind of presentation in terms of the technical kind of side of it there. And hopefully now our last speaker, Richard, will bring things together with a case study in terms of how he's fared with his own business exporting to the USA. Over to you, Richard.
So good morning from California. It's a pleasure to speak to you all today. Hopefully I'll give you some insight into our business and what we've done in the US commercially for the last 2 years, but working on it since 2010. So if we go to the next slide, just to talk about what scalp cooling is. So it's an incredibly important treatment. It's a reduction of hair loss for patients that are undergoing chemotherapy treatment. And what hair loss means to patients is it is a most severe side effect of the treatment in about 75% of the patients. And we see it as a traumatic side effect and often can lead to social isolation. It affects self-image more than breast surgery. And even 10% of patients may refuse chemotherapy because of hair loss. So incredibly important and affect millions of patients all around the world. If we look at the next slide, I'm going to talk about why we do what we do. And I think that the why in any business is important. So we're very passionate, and it all started back in the 90s when my mum was diagnosed with late-stage breast cancer. She was in her early 30s. I was 10 years old at the time. And the idea of losing her hair was something she didn't want to face. My mum was offered something called scalp cooling all those years ago, but unfortunately it was unsuccessful. And for my mum, that was a real turning point in her disease, the real first time she cried. So seeing that distress, my father started to look at, well, why didn't it work and what can we do to help patients in the future? We've dedicated the last 20 years in developing scalp cooling technology, and our goal really is to make sure that this is available for any patient, no matter what income, anywhere that they are in the world. Unfortunately, we lost my mum 20 years ago, so we're incredibly passionate about why we do what we do. The next slide just very briefly talks about how it works. So induces vasoconstriction by cooling. We see a drop in metabolic rate by cooling, so less targeted effect of the chemotherapy. And then we've got other research programs looking at more about the mechanisms, and we're actually seeing less drug diffuse through the cell membrane at lower temperatures. If we look at the next slide, we just look at the product so you get an idea of what it looks like and what we're distributing around different parts of the world. So it's a very simple, small refrigeration unit, which you can see on the right-hand side. And we operate a couple of models. We operate a distributor model where we sell capital equipment directly to the distribution network we've got globally, or we go direct. We also have two types of models where we have a reusable cooling cap model, which is worn by the patient 30 minutes before chemo, during chemo, and after chemo. And we also have a single patient use cooling cap, which is something we've implemented more recently in the last 2 years, specifically designed for the US market and other new global markets. And that really helps with the recurring revenues and overall growth. If we go to the next slide, just to demonstrate our growth over the last couple of years, we have gone from around 20 people in 2016, 2017, and we'll probably reach around 50 employees by the end of 2019. And this is really to service our growing demand globally. On our next slide, just shows you how heavily regulated we are. So for those of you who are medical device manufacturers or pharma, you know, it's a tough market to be in, although the reward is pretty impressive. You really need the resource to make sure that you can put these regulatory approvals into place. And it's not just about getting the approvals, it's then maintaining them, which is incredibly important, and keeping up to speed. And I think, you know, my colleague who spoke earlier touched base on that. You really need the resource to ensure that you can keep up to speed with the ever-changing regulatory pathways. On our next slide, we talk about the burden of cancer. So for our business, the opportunity is huge. And I know that's not the same for every organization, but cancer affects us, so many people across so many countries. So as a company, export is really key for us. If we look at the next slide, we actually then talk about the growth in cancer. So around 80 million patients will have cancer diagnosis in 2018, and that's increased to nearly 30 million by 2040. If we go to the next slide. So where we are today as a business. So I joined the business in 2009. And what was very clear to me is that we had a great organization in the UK. We did a small amount of export, but no real strategy behind it. So when I joined the business, it was really important to me to really capitalize on this opportunity, but also go back to our beliefs that actually we should make this available for all patients around the world. So as of today, we're in 99% of the National Health Service. We export currently on a regular basis to about 35 markets in the world. We've treated well over 100,000 patients, and we have about 3,500 scalp coolers installed worldwide. If we skip past the next slide and go on to the US, here what we can see is a huge opportunity in the USA. So again, for those of you that are looking at the US, and especially an oncology market, we're looking at 1.7 million new cancer cases every single year. And our main focus originally was 250,000 breast cancer patients. So even a small proportion of that has a huge impact on the business. Our next slide looks at chemotherapy use, which is more focused on exactly who we are targeting. So realistically, we're targeting between 225,000 and 400,000 new cancer patients every single year. And this was one of the main drivers for the change in our business model. So as opposed to just selling capital equipment and reusable cooling caps, what we decided to do is that we need to change the business model, install equipment on a low lease cost or even free of charge to really capitalize on that market, and then sell single patient use cooling caps, which is showing positive results. If we flip to the next slide, this just talks about when we first looked at the US market. So back in 2010, we first started to review the market. And what was really important to understand is that, we needed to get out there and go and see the market, go and understand the market, not just learn about it from your computer. So go and speak with the hospitals, go and speak with the regulatory people, and go and speak with the advocacy groups and understand what the best route to market might well be. I think really understanding the regulatory aspects of that market was key, and how to get there. Is it a 510K? Is it a PMA? There's so many different ways of getting your device approved, depending on the type of device and whether it's got a predicate or not. And in addition to that, use the support that's already there for you. So I'm a big believer in Department for International Trade. They've been a huge support for our business and continue to be. If we look at the next slide, this is really just to demonstrate that we need to be patient. So we learned about the regulatory pathway. We started building relationships with a number of centres and hospitals throughout the US. So from 2010 to 2013, it was really about understanding that regulatory pathway, but also building those relationships. By 2013, we started our clinical trial, which was a large randomized controlled trial, which took significant investment, and it took significant time. So it was really important to understand that we needed to be patient. I was quite naive at the time and thought it would happen much quicker and it would cost a lot less. We invested over the 6 years around £2 million to get into the marketplace, and that's before even looking at commercialisation. So I think we've got to really be patient, but also make sure you've got the resource in place to really take this forward. We go to the next slide. We talk about what we did and in terms of resource to expand into the US. So we decided we'd go direct, but to go direct, what we needed is the resource to do that. So as a company, we reviewed different opportunities from further VC funding to the public market in the UK, private equity, debt financing, but we ended up going public on the First North NASDAQ. We raised around over £3 million to enter the US market and build our infrastructure. And that was a really good move for us at the time, and really has allowed us to expand into the US market. So I think, again, it's back to being prepared and making sure it's a big place. If you want to make a big splash, you need the resource to do it. On the next slide, just to touch base on the infrastructure we did build. So as opposed to doing everything direct, we worked with a strategic partner, and that strategic partner is McKesson. So my vision was that rather than looking at one particular state in the United States, which is a recommendation by many, I wanted the ability to provide this to all patients throughout the whole of the US. So over 50 states, as we've already heard today, they're all very different laws, different cultures, very diverse in geography and how you do business. But I wanted the infrastructure to be able to support that and not have to turn away hospitals or patients. So the money we used to work with McKesson, who developed what we call the Paxman Hub, which is our patient management call center. It's open 8 a.m. till 8 p.m. in Eastern time. We have a number of people working there, and they're really there to support our patients, but also support our physicians and nurses, and really be that point of contact on a daily basis. We have third-party logistics set up, and we also have a pharmacy to manage the distribution of our cooling caps, which go directly to the patient's home. In terms of our own headcount, we have a headquarters in Houston. We were helped by Department of International Trade in Houston on setting up that office. It's a Delaware incorporated company. And then we have feet on the ground. So we have about 8 people working for us in the US in different areas. Again, recruitment can be difficult. Finding the right people, I'm sure you'll understand, is not easy in the UK, let alone somewhere in a foreign country. So this really allows us to provide full support for the whole of the US. We go to the next slide. We just quickly talk about our process. So we're installing equipment throughout the US. That means the scalp cooling equipment. We provide training and support to all those providers. And then it's over to the physician to talk about scalp cooling. What happens then is a prescription is filled in. That's sent across to our Paxman Hub. Our Paxman Hub intake that prescription, make an outbound call to our patient anywhere they are in the US. We then take payment immediately through credit card or ACH payments. Once that payment is processed, we dispatch a single patient use cooling cap directly to that patient's home. We then offer that patient training support online or via face-to-face opportunities such as FaceTime to provide them the support they need to how to use the device. And then the patient takes their scalp cooling cap directly to that home. So we have that infrastructure set up, and it's to date really doing well. On our next slide, we look at what we need to provide in terms of technical services. So we've worked with a third party again, not requiring our own infrastructure and investment, to actually provide service and maintenance and technical telephone support to all of our US customers. If we go to the next slide, just very briefly, we did continue to expand our indication. So initially it was breast cancer, and now it's all solid tumor cancer, so widening our potential use. The next slide looks at what we've achieved in the last 2 years. So our first piece of equipment went in June 2017. We've now got 500 scalp coolers in around 259 locations across 37 states. We're incredibly proud of what we're doing. We're installed in some of the best cancer centers in the US, well, in the world, in fact. Next slide. Just looks at our revenue growth. So, albeit still a very small company, we're seeing significant growth quarter by quarter, and this will continue to increase. So we did $2 million in our first year, and we expect that to at least double in our second year. Next slide. Great opportunity. I think anyone that is looking at the US knows this. Even with just 25% of those high-risk patients, we could have revenues of close to $100 million. Next slide. And one of the things I would really recommend for any company in the medical device arena looking at US is not just the regulatory pathway, but also the reimbursement pathway. So it's really important that you ensure you look at how you're going to get this product paid for. So at the moment, our current product is paid for out of pocket, but you really need to understand the reimbursement pathway and start this early on as possible. Again, it's another big investment, but I would really strongly recommend looking at it even at the point of looking at your FDA regulatory pathway. And this way, you would hopefully get approval and soon after get reimbursement. NCCN, if you work in the oncology arena, is a really important process as well. And get your products on the guidelines. This is critical. Next slide just looks at lobbying the government. So this is another opportunity. We're looking at different states across the US, getting bills to propose mandatory coverage for scalp cooling costs. A difficult process, but again, something you could possibly look at. Next slide, I think, finishes us off, and hopefully not too much over. So really our top tips, so get on a plane and build the relationships. That's important for any market you enter into. Do your market research, so understand the regulatory requirements. Do your due diligence on your prospective partners. Peer-to-peer learning, for me, was huge. So I've always thought that it's best to go and figure out what other people have done, and that's key. Ensure you've got the resources you need, that time, money, and energy. Use the expertise we have at our fingertips. So DIT, Chamber of Commerce, the webinar we're on today. Be patient, it always takes longer than expected. Be passionate, so be passionate about everything you do. I think that's key. And then people, find the right team. That's critical in this. And that's me done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. As ever, it's always great to hear from a case study, and hopefully there's some real nuggets of practical kind of useful tips there which people can learn from and apply to their own businesses. We're now going to head to the Q&A part of the webinar. So you can ask questions using the control panel to the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll be doing this for about 10 minutes. So please do feel free to ask any questions. The first one I'm going to put forward is going to go back to Gary, and it's from Simon, who asks, who should hold the FDA import license, the importer or the exporter? Gary.
Thanks, William. Actually, it's rather more a matter of determining what product we're talking about here. There is no FDA license as such for importers. The way things work with FDA regulations is for food, beverage, and dietary supplements, anything in that category of products. The FDA, first of all, does not approve those products. It's more concerned about identifying and registering the places that manufacture, process, pack, or store. So the responsibility in that particular case for food, beverage, and for dietary supplements is for any company that manufactures, processes, packs, or stores to register their facility with the FDA. So there, the focus is not on the product, but actually on where it's manufactured, processed, packed, or stored. The only regulations that apply then to the product are rather more to do with things like labeling. So the FDA does not approve food, beverage, or dietary supplements. However, the FDA does approve, as has been mentioned earlier, medical devices, pharmaceuticals, and generally the life science products. They want to look at these and approve them before they actually enter the US market. So there's not as such a license or an import license that the importer needs to concern himself with. All the responsibility rather more falls on the supplier of the goods. The importer has certain responsibilities with regard to FDA regulations, but the vast majority of the onus falls on the supplier of the products.
Thank you, Gary. And we had a question in from Jonathan, who I'm going to put this to Neil first. He asks, how is the Made in the UK brand perceived in America?
Really well. But that is based on my limited experience of brands within kind of the consumer retail market going over there. But I think it's in terms of how you present it as well in your product. But on the whole, you know, there's a very positive view of, you know, the idea of made in Britain. But that's not going to be applicable to everything. You know, if you go in with, you know, certain I don't know, you know, sports items or products like that, you know, you're not really going to stand much chance up against the likes of Nike, etc. So if you're going in with unique kind of products, services, something like that, and it, you know, you can tie it in with the idea of British, made in Britain, then that definitely goes down well. You know, we were last year working very intensely with a company that's done quite well within cosmetics, and they wanted to launch in the US, and they went in kind of very, you know, giving that idea of you know, high-end products. It was all very much, you know, made in Britain, and they've done very, very well. So I think it's something you should definitely try and promote, but it's not always going to be applicable. It depends, you know, depending on what you do and what you're selling.
Richard, is this something you found useful as well in your industry?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the US really do look at Britain as making high quality, good products. So yeah, and I think if it's probably a luxury brand, there tends to be positivity over it, and also yeah, medical devices, and the British accent I think helps as well.
Of course. Another question for you, Richard, and it's from Joanne, who asked about what is your experience hiring employees in the USA?
So to date, we've got a team of 8 people in the US. We've had some support from DIT with our administrative team in Houston, and then yeah, I would say it's quite difficult. I think the cultural side of things is hard. So we have a very different business here in the UK. So the types of people, I guess, are very different. I think going back to the presentation on culture, that sort of people really being out for themselves and being very hungry for the next thing is very different than what we've experienced here in the UK. So I found that a little bit difficult, to be honest. But have managed. We've got a good team. We found a lot of people approached us for work, so went through an interview process that way. But it's not totally easy. We're looking at the next steps for hiring some new people for probably more senior roles, which I think will be more difficult to fill, and we're looking at using recruitment agencies for that specific option.
Thank you, Richard. Gary, we've had a couple more questions regarding the FDA, not too surprising given the reputation, obviously, of the difficulty getting things through it. We've had a couple from Michelle, who asks kind of what causes the main delays with FDA clearance, and she also asks kind of what information do you need to be providing to the FDA, particularly on a commercial invoice document?
Well, really, it depends. I would guess again on the product, but if we're focusing on the export function, the actual shipment to the USA and the arrival and the import customs clearance, most delays are in involving the FDA are ones where they want to look at the product, they want to look at the documentation for the product. For each and every food and beverage shipment that you send to the USA, you have to do a thing called prior notice, which is like an advance notice to the FDA that the goods are going to turn up at an American airport or port. So they will be looking at the prior notice, that submission that they received for food and beverage. Otherwise, the FDA can detain and inspect both the products and the documentation for any product arriving into the USA. That's a random situation. In those cases, really, in terms of the documentation that you will have done for the product, the normal documentation for shipping to the USA just involves a commercial invoice, maybe a packing list. For food and beverage, it will be a prior notice submission that you'd have to send as well. But the FDA, if they're going to be looking at something, they're going to be looking at any approvals for the product, let's say a medical device or a pharmaceutical or something like that. They're going to look at the registration details for that type of product, which are not specifically shown on the export documentation. They would be looking into the registration numbers of the particular company involved, or the approval numbers for the company involved. So it can be a broad range of reasons that the FDA will detain and look at some things. All that you need to do in terms of your documentation is just to ensure that you provide the correct information.
Thank you, Richard. And a question for I'm going to put this to Richard first. So thank you, Gary. And a question for Richard from Emma. Do you have any advice in terms of fulfillment in the USA?
So you mean in terms of getting your product to end consumer, or to sort of hospitals? What type of product is it?
So, yeah, I think so. Emma, do type in if there's a clarification, but yeah, I think that's what we mean.
Yeah, okay. So what we've done is utilize a third party called McKesson, and they've been a great resource. So although there was a reasonable amount of investment that we needed to make with that organisation, they've supported us. We found those through our early on due diligence, so looking at what sort of providers would allow us to expand across the US quickly. And they've got a huge infrastructure, they've got a great footprint, and they work with FedEx, I think, and UPS to ensure we can get product next day or day after to end user.
Okay, thank you. And we'll do one last question. This is starting to run low on time, and it's an interesting question indeed from Michael, who's asking kind of what additional documentation will be required if there were to be a UK-US trade deal, or do you think there'll be a reduction? And I guess more generally, what impacts could a trade deal have? So I'm going to put that through to Gary initially. So Gary, what impact could a US-UK trade deal have for us?
Well, free trade agreements or trade agreements really revolve around tariffs and regulatory matters. So with regard to documentation, trade agreements generally mean that the exporting party is going to have to provide some proof of origin of the for the goods to comply with the agreements within the free trade agreement. That's to say that if you're going to be exporting something to America and you want it, to benefit from tariffs that the Americans then offer or provide, then you need to certify that your products are of UK origin. And bound up in free trade agreements are these specifics about what percentage of the product must be made within the UK. So the only thing that's likely to come about with regard to additional documentation, if we go into a free trade agreement with the USA at some stage, is something that determines the origin of the products. But otherwise, there's a general trend away from documentation to digital systems these days, such things as blockchain and everything else. So really the future is likely to get simpler with regard to documentation rather than more complicated. And it's the same thing with regard to regulatory matters. The USA, with regard to FDA regulations, for example, it takes the same approach to regulatory matters, irrespective of where the goods are coming from. So even if the UK goes into a free trade agreement with the USA, those regulatory requirements will remain the same because the free trade agreement won't, or it's unlikely to affect that. If anything, the FDA is actually taking steps to try and harmonize regulatory arrangements around the world with the FDA regulations. So again, the outlook is likely to be simpler and perhaps easier to comply with for certain things, anyway, things like medical products and so on. So I wouldn't say it's a doom and gloom scenario.
Great, thank you. Well, plenty to keep abreast of in the next few years. So yeah, thank you, Gary. Thank you as well to Richard and Neil. I think we're going to wrap up now, but yeah, thank you everyone for listening and thank you for the presentations and answers. So in terms of what we've got coming up at the Institute of Exports and International Trade, many of you would have heard about the new export controls profession we've set up for people involved in controls and licenses and trade sanctions. If you're involved in that line of work, this is a great opportunity to gain industry recognition, access continuing professional development, and get support from a network of professionals in the space. More information can be found on the exportcontrolprofession.co.uk website, and we'd be delighted to tell you more about how you can get involved. The Institute continues to do a lot of work in professionalising skills and knowledge around international customs as well. Our customs pathway is an ideal way for you to become a recognised customs expert. This is a combination of one-day training courses that can be taken towards gaining a customs practitioner award. And the Institute is taking its World Trade Summit programme to Bristol next week, where indeed Neil will be speaking. And there we'll be looking at opportunities for exporters beyond the EU, particularly India, China and Southeast Asia. This is a great opportunity to hear from global trade experts and network with fellow trade professionals. So if you're based in the Southwest, do definitely come along to this. More information can be found at export.org.uk. In terms of Open to Export, our next Beyond the EU webinar will be looking at the whole continent of Africa, which will be a fantastic session, I'm sure. This will be taking place on Thursday next week, July 4th, and you can find sign-up details at opentoexport.com/webinars. As always, please take our exit survey to let us know what you thought of today's webinar and to give us thoughts and suggestions of future topics. Anyway, thank you for now and speak to you soon. Bye.